Hare Krishna. So today we're starting the 11th part of our Bhagavad Gita Bhakti Shastri course. And today will be chapter 6. We're starting chapter 6 we're taking from verses 1 to text 23. And the topic of chapter 6 is dhyana yoga or meditation. Srila Prabhupada also, he equates it with Ashtanga yoga, the eightfold yoga system. But it's about this meditation part. That's also what Ashtanga yoga is about. So we'll take it's about half the chapter we'll cover today, and we'll cover the rest of it next week. And we'll start out with verses 1 through 4, which explains the transition between Jnana Yoga and Dhyana Yoga. So the knowledge and transferring to meditation. Okay? It's a transition that's happening here, and explains how that happens. In the first verse, it says, the Supreme Personality of Godhead said, one who is unattached to the fruits of his work and who works as he is obligated is in the renounced order of life, and he is the true mystic or yogi, not he who lights no fire and performs no duty. So they're mentioning here that there's what it takes to be a real sannyasi and a real yogi. And it says it's an unattachment to the fruits of work, and who does his duty as obligated. That's the real sign. So Krishna begins this chapter, and he's repeating his advocacy of karma yoga and warning against premature renunciation of activity. This is a recurring theme that we've had throughout these early chapters of Bhagavad Gita, that Arjuna keeps trying to find ways that he isn't going to participate in the battle. And Krishna keeps telling him that he should act. You shouldn't avoid your duty, and you shouldn't do it with a mentality of getting something from it. He says you aim at transcendence, and he gave him this process, how he could realize himself as a soul. He gave him the information, and then he gave him the understanding. Now, this is what you do in order to come to the understanding that you're a spirit soul. And so he says, you do what you're supposed to do, because that helps you to overcome being controlled by sensations. He told him you have to tolerate, even if it's unpleasant. You have to do your duty, even if not doing your duty caused you to have something pleasant. You can't avoid your duty. So you begin to have a certain amount of self-control. And he says, and then, generally when you do your duty, when you perform the proper actions, you get good karma for it. He says, but you don't worry about that. This is the karma yoga he explained. You do it without thinking of the result. You aim for transcendence. You aim for trying to understand yourself as a soul. And that is going to produce knowledge in you. So he said, even if you become advanced in that, he said you should, and you have no need to there's no duty. So for somebody who's enlightened and who's advanced in that practice, who's attained to knowledge, jnana, that there's no need for them. They have no duty. But said still, Krishna says, even I'm God. I don't have any duty at all, but I'm still acting in accordance with the position I'm taking here in the world. He says, because otherwise, he says, people will follow my example. They'll follow your example. So he says, in order to help people who are not on the same level, you should teach them to do their duties. It's better for people to do their karma, their prescribed activities, their dharma, even with the desire for the results, than it is to not do it. That produces negative results for them. So, so if you just give up your duty, even if you're on that level to do so, you're going to mislead. People are going to imitate you, and they're going to be hurt by that. He says, and besides, it doesn't hurt you. If you really have knowledge, continuing to act doesn't inhibit you in any way whatsoever. And of course, he warned them at the beginning. He said, if somebody gives up their duties, gives up their activities prematurely, it's something that's not going to work. So you need to act in the way I'm telling you, in order to gain knowledge, in order to gain better control of yourself. Then it's possible to announce your activities. But even in chapter 4, he says, even if that happens, even if you come to the point of transcendental knowledge, actually it's chapter 5 he talks about it. In chapter 4 we talk about how to get that transcendental knowledge. So even if you have that, in chapter 5 he tells Arjuna, you should continue to do the karma yoga. Because it's a more stable path. Even if you think you're at that capacity, we saw in chapter 2 how the tortoise withdraws his limbs into the shell of a person in deep knowledge, sthita pragya, can withdraw their senses from their objects, but can they keep them there? That's the difference. So he says it's much safer, because it doesn't hurt anything, to continue to perform your karma yoga. Okay? Now, Prabhupada says in his purport, he says, in this chapter, the Lord explains that the process of the eightfold yoga system is a means to control the mind and senses. However, this is very difficult for people in general to perform, especially in the age of Kali. So when we get into the details of this meditational system, or the Ashtanga yoga system, I think you'll see very clearly why Prabhupada says things like this. He goes through quite a bit, many times in this chapter, and he explains how bhakti is a better choice, and how the practice of this particular type of yoga system is very, very, very difficult. And I think when we get into the details of what's supposed to happen, I think we'll be able to understand that very, very well indeed. And here Prabhupada comments on the verse. He says, the sannyasis sometimes artificially think that they have become liberated from all material duties, and therefore they cease to perform agnihotra yajnas, or fire sacrifices. But actually they are self-interested because their goal is to become one with the impersonal Brahman. Such a desire is greater than any material desire, but it is not without self-interest. Similarly, the mystic yogi who practices the yoga system with half-open eyes, ceasing all material activities, desires some satisfaction for his personal self. But a person acting in Krishna consciousness works for the satisfaction of the whole without self-interest. And this is a really subtle point that Prabhupada is making here. And it's something that we'll discuss a lot more when we are in the next chapters when we discuss bhakti. But Krishna has told Arjuna to have a different purpose for his life than almost everybody else does. He tells him to aim for liberation, to aim for going beyond, he says, the three modes of nature, beyond the material world. He says, I want you to understand that you are, a spiritual being, and have no part in this world. So everybody else is trying to find happiness here and to create a better future or a better present. And he says, I don't want you to do that. And Prabhupada says that even this, he says here that this is certainly greater than any material desire. It's more refined. But he said there's a tinge of selfishness there. That this Krishna says many places that this world is a place of misery, and so you want to get out of it. He said first told Arjuna that he should become deathless, amrit. Death is not very pleasant. Become immortal. Go Brahma Nirvana, transcend this world. And so we can do that. And oftentimes, the argument is made. If you really want happiness, get out of the cycle of birth and death. The cycle of reincarnation never produces anything lasting. But if we're thinking in that way, there's a certain selfishness. We're thinking of our own, it's like a higher type of self-interest. Enlightened self-interest, as we usually say. It's an enlightened self-interest. So it's more refined, it's much better. But Prabhupada says that when we perform bhakti, or devotion to God, even that bit of self-interest goes away. He says that a person acting in Krishna consciousness works for the satisfaction of the whole without self-interest, and the whole means Krishna. God is the source of everything and the controller of everything. So he oftentimes gives this example of a part of the body serves the interests of the whole body. And so we see ourselves as a part. And we talked about this with the Ishopanishad. We explained who the Lord was and how we should cooperate with the Lord in that way. So anyway, this is a point that will come up later on when we study bhakti more carefully. But there's a certain way, there's no self-interest at all in pure bhakti. Now in the second verse, Krishna says, what is called renunciation, sannyas, you should know to be the same as yoga, or linking oneself with the Supreme, O son of Pandu, for one can never become a yogi unless he renounces the desire for sense gratification. So again, he's talking up the process of karma. And it says, don't think. He said a similar thing at the beginning of chapter 5. Don't think that karma yoga and renunciation are separate things. So they're both producing the same result. There's different forms of the same thing. They have the same aim. They're not two separate endeavors with different goals. And the same thing here. The practice of meditation, or dhyana yoga, it requires non-attachment to material things. Karma yoga should be seen as a prerequisite to dhyana yoga rather than as a separate endeavor. So the karma yoga is increasing, and especially as it's maturing into jnana yoga, or knowledge, is causing the practitioner to become less and less concerned with everything material. And so by doing that, they're making the precondition for what we're about to deal with, the meditational yoga, dhyana yoga. There's jnana yoga and dhyana yoga. Okay? And Srila Prabhupada says, in the purport, he says, the purpose of knowledge and of restraining the senses, as prescribed in the jnana and yoga processes, is automatically served in Krishna consciousness. If one is unable to give up the activities of his selfish nature, then jnana and yoga are of no avail. The real aim is for a living entity to give up all selfish satisfaction and to be prepared to satisfy the Supreme. So he's making a couple of different things. He's making another plug for bhakti, that he says if somebody is trying to please the Lord, automatically one is going to achieve this result of jnana and yoga. There's going to be knowledge is going to occur in the same way, because again, it's the selflessness or the lack of really gross selfishness that makes the karma yoga work. We mentioned how as long as we're really absorbed in the external world and really concerned about what's happening, next, what's going to happen now, what am I going to get in the future, that keeps one from being able to understand one's own self. One's power of consciousness is absorbed. We talked about that power of absorption. And so also in bhakti, if we're serving God, that becomes a non-selfish endeavor. And we simply are asking for the Lord's pleasure. And so that performs that same function. Plus, we mentioned how there's a stronger, higher taste element involved in that. And the senses are controlled in the way that we talked about in the Nectar of Instruction. That there's two notions of control. One is to, as Prabhupada says, you restrain, to stop them from functioning. And the other thing is to make them function in the way you like. And so that's what bhakti does. You have them function in the Lord's service. And then again, he's mentioning here, he says, if one is unable to give up the activities of his selfish nature, then jnana and yoga are of no avail. So that this is a prerequisite. There's a prerequisite involved in both of these processes. One has to take up the karma yoga. Whereas with bhakti, Prabhupada will argue many times that immediately, as soon as you begin to at least do something in the service of the Lord, you get this higher taste and you're attracted to do more and more and more. It's not so much that you have to become non-selfish up front. You try it a little bit. You try to do a little service. You stick your little toe in the water first instead of having to dive in. So text number 3 is for one who is a neophyte in the Eightfold Yoga system. Aruruksho is the Sanskrit term. Work is said to be the means. And for one who is already elevated in yoga, cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. See, now this is the first time that Krishna considers that you can give up activities. He says that for somebody who's beginning this yoga practice, trying to become qualified for it, desiring to practice this meditation or yoga, then they should do this karma yoga. But for somebody who's qualified, then it says cessation of all material activities is said to be the means. So previously he never indicates, he's always saying, oh, even if you're qualified in jnana, even if you have the transcendental knowledge, continue to do your duty and perform karma yoga. Now he's suggesting for the first time that there's another step in the ladder. So that basically, and it says it goes from karma yoga to jnana yoga. And he was saying throughout that even through the process of jnana yoga, keep doing your karma yoga. It's safer. And it won't impede your jnana, your knowledge at all. So just keep doing it. Now he's saying he's pointing to a way that at some point you're going to give it up. You're going to transition. So when jnana yoga transitions to dhyana yoga or meditation, then activities are going to stop. Of course, that's only if there's qualification. And he was making that point at the beginning of the chapter as well. If you're really, really qualified, then you can take up this path. And Prabhupada says in the purport, he says, a Krishna-conscious person, however, is situated from the beginning on the platform of meditation because he always thinks of Krishna. And being constantly engaged in the service of Krishna, he is considered to have ceased all material activities. So again, he's putting a plug for bhakti. And says at the end, when we discover exactly how this meditational process works, this is going to become crystal clear. So Prabhupada, almost throughout the chapter, he keeps mentioning how everything that's being done here is being done by bhakti, and that it's much more practical and doable. And I think we'll understand that very clearly. Then in the 4th verse, and this is showing how what it takes to be qualified to make this transition from karma and jnana yoga to meditation or dhyana yoga. A person is said to be elevated in yoga aruda, when having renounced all material desires, He neither acts for sense gratification, it's indriya arteshu, for the purpose of the senses, nor engages in fruitive activities, doing things, desiring the material results. So this is the qualification. If you don't have that, forget about it. Back to karma yoga, and hopefully you'll reach that at some point. So this is the qualifications. In the beginning of karma yoga, and you can see how it develops a little bit. In the beginning of karma yoga, one tolerates the sensations of not allowing unpleasant ones to make one averse to duty, or for pleasant ones to attract one away from duty. I kind of messed up on this little sentence here. But in karma yoga, the first thing that Krishna told Arjuna, one of the first things is you have to tolerate it. That this is really unpleasant taking part in the battle. But he says you have to tolerate it. You can't be controlled by just wanting things to be pleasant rather than unpleasant. We do that anyway just to live. Sometimes we have to do things that aren't very pleasant. Medical procedures, dental procedures. We know it's for the greater good. And there's sometimes, there may be something that's enjoyable that we know just isn't, the result isn't going to be very good. We shouldn't do it, and so we refrain. So he says for Arjuna, you have to tolerate. At first, you just have to do what your duty is, regardless of whether it's going to be pleasant or unpleasant, or whether you're going to miss out on some happiness or not. Don't be pulled away from your duty by hopes of pleasure, and don't be repelled from your duty by unpleasantness. So it starts out like that. Krishna talks a lot about this attachment and aversion, how you bring that under control. So at first, by doing one's duty, one's forced to confront this having to tolerate, and faces one's attachments and one's aversions, and begins to control that, and without a notion that I'm going to get something wonderful because I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing it only for doing the right thing. I don't want the material results of that. Later on, as the jnana develops, the knowledge, one experiences oneself as a soul, we know this before, there's a whole transformation that takes place. And then suddenly, the sensations don't mean so much anymore. We're really focused on our sensations. Oh, I'm cold, I'm hot, I'm this, But when you realize yourself as a spiritual entity, as a soul, these things seem very superficial and extraneous even. And so we noticed, even at the beginning of the second chapter, and it's been repeated throughout the other chapters, how then one reaches this level of jnana or knowledge, and begins to experience themselves as a soul, how they even lose any desire for material things. Even the material desires begin to go away. So when this really becomes mature, then somebody can take up the process of meditation. And we'll see why pretty clearly as we see what they do. And Prabhupada says in his purport, he says, and this is another plug for bhakti, without Krishna consciousness, one must be always seeking self-centered or extended selfish activities. But a Krishna-conscious person can do everything for the satisfaction of Krishna and thereby be perfectly detached from sense gratification. One who has no such realization must mechanically try to escape material desires before being elevated to the top rung of the yoga ladder. Okay? Simply by service and by the higher taste, one can accomplish this. It doesn't come as a prerequisite. It develops you begin devotional service, you begin serving Krishna, and then the material desires begin to go away. Okay. So now there's another section. I'm breaking up into sections. It's verses 5 through 9, and this is about controlling the mind. That this is a real fundamental part of dhyana yoga. Because when we cease the external activities, what they're going to do is actually try to withdraw their attention from everything external. And so I guess we can see why there can't be any material desires or desire to enjoy pleasant sensations or to avoid unpleasant ones. It's going to take intense concentration. So all these distractions have to be minimized. If you've ever tried to sit and meditate, you know what happens. The mind bothers you, your body bothers you, you're remembering this, or you're thinking about what happened yesterday or tomorrow, or what's going to happen tomorrow, these kind of things. So controlling the mind becomes a very central element here in this process. Previously in the karma yoga process, the mind could be used. It was active. The body and the mind were active. They had a different outlook, but they were active. So when you try to stop them, stopping the body is hard enough, as Krishna mentioned in chapter 3, but stopping the mind from doing all sorts of things is much more difficult. So in the 5th verse of the 6th chapter, Krishna says, one must deliver himself with the help of his mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. And Prabhupada says in his purport, he says, since the mind is the central point of yoga practice, Atma refers here to the mind. Because if you look at the verse, it's quite interesting. The purpose of the yoga system is to control the mind and draw it away from attachment to sense objects. As it just says, one must deliver atmana. And atma, actually I think Prabhupada will say later on, he says it can mean so many, it just means self. And so depending upon our perspective, it can mean many different things. It can mean your body. If you think the body is yourself. So it's myself. I've hurt myself. Or it can be the mind. It can be the soul itself. So it can be many, many different things. Whatever you consider the self to be, it can mean that. So in a very, very literal way, it says one must deliver himself by the self. Right? And not degrade himself. Right? But the Prabhupada and the other commentators say that in this case, the Atma refers to the mind, because that's what's happening here. So there's ways to distinguish through context and things what is really meant by self in this case. So he says, Atma refers here to the mind. The purpose of the yoga system is to control the mind and draw it away from attachment to sense objects. So we're going to reverse that process we talked about. How we're captivated by the sensory input. The mind is captivated, the intelligence is captivated. We talked about how kama, desire, has all those different sitting places in the senses, in the mind, and in the intelligence. And so they're outward facing. The mind thinks of things and accepts or rejects them. The intelligence also the different desires can arise in each of those places. The intelligence can say, hey, look, here's an opportunity for enjoyment. And the mind can say, yes, let's do that. And the senses become eager. Or the senses can have we're creatures of habit many times. And so if you're used to doing something at a certain time, the senses will say, hey, it's time to do whatever it is. People who try to quit smoking, and that's one of the things they fight, is that they generally smoke at certain times. And the urge to comes very strong at that time. To change any kind of behavior is like that. So the senses are creatures of habit. The mind thinks, so let's do this. And then the mind and intelligence climb on board and are helping out with that. So that means our attention is focused out into the externals. And we are so much absorbed in that we can't even perceive our own selves. We've mentioned that several times. how all we can do is we can kind of perceive that we're here unconscious, but we can't understand who we are. So the system of meditation is trying to reverse that process in a really radical way, to take all of our attention away from everything external. So I think you can just imagine how difficult that is just by, try it. Try not to, even if you close your eyes, don't you look at the blackness. Even if you plug your ears, you listen to the silence. So, try not to see something, try not to hear anything, try not to smell anything or feel anything. And what to speak of think anything. Just, it's a daunting task. So in the 6th verse, he says, "For him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends, but for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy." And he says in his purport, "Unless the mind is controlled, the practice of yoga," and he says in parentheses, "for show, is simply a waste of time." So he's talking about meditation. If you can't control the mind, you can sit there and look pretty in whatever asana you want to do, but meditation just isn't happening, because meditation means controlling the mind. Real yoga practice entails meeting the Paramatma within the heart and then following his dictation. For one who takes to Krishna consciousness directly, perfect surrender to the dictation of the Lord follows automatically. So another plug for bhakti and a further explanation of what the purpose of the yoga system is going to be. We're not only going to understand ourselves completely as souls, but we're going to understand, wait, I'm not alone. So this is the and we'll see this is how the yoga ladder then leads pretty easily to bhakti. Once we realize through jnana we were beginning to experience ourselves as souls, this jnana is going to make that a full reality, and then we're going to discover, hey, guess what? There's somebody else here. There's Krishna in the form of the super soul. Right there with us. That's the purpose of this meditation. And then in 7, it says, "For one who has conquered the mind, the super soul, the Paramatma, is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, heat and cold, honor and dishonor are all the same." This heat and cold, happiness and distress should echo for you from the 2nd chapter. We already talked about that verse. It's 2nd chapter, text 14, where it said the same thing, right? That you should tolerate heat and cold, happiness and distress. And then later on, he also mentioned, he adds also the honor and dishonor, because he mentioned that also later on in the 2nd chapter as something he has to learn how to tolerate. So again, what's happening is someone who's completely conquered the mind, and we're gonna. This is just an introduction of what happens into deep meditation. That's going to be described in detail later. It says at that point, then it says the super soul is reached. That's how Prabhupada translates the samahita. He says approached completely, and in that state, people will they won't notice any difference between heat and cold, happiness or distress, or honor or dishonor. If you notice it in 2:15, that's what it said. That when one comes to the point where those things are the same, that then the state of liberation or deathlessness is there. One's qualified for that. So this is kind of we're bringing back those 2 verses kind of together here. And then the commentators, they say that samahita, or approach completely, refers to samadhi, or full absorption. And Prabhupada also says, it's interesting in his purport, he seems to acknowledge that. And also I looked at how he translates that same term, and sometimes it says in trance or in full focus and concentration. This state is practical samadhi, or absorption in the Supreme. I'm taking it that he emphasized that we attain or completely reach the Supersoul, because later on he mentions how some people think that you merge with the Supersoul. That the Supersoul, your soul merges with that. And he argues against that understanding. That's not a bhakti understanding. And so I'm suspecting that he, instead of saying like full absorption in the Supersoul, he was emphasizing the fact that we will see the Supersoul and will be two separate things by saying we reach the Supersoul. That seems likely to me. And that's why he translated in that way, so that we don't make a mistake. And then in 6.8, it says, a person is said to be established in self-realization and is called a yogi or mystic when he is fully satisfied by virtue of acquired knowledge and realization. Such a person is situated in transcendence and is self-controlled. He sees everything, whether it be pebbles, stones, or gold, as the same. So by jnana and vijnana, satisfied. And they're steady. It says kutastha. It actually says the soul is kutastha. It doesn't change. It's situated. And so he says spirits are situated. The indriya, the senses, are completely controlled. Not jitta, but vijita, very much controlled. And so that person, we already talked about how, in transcendental knowledge we see all entities the same. But here again, usually we would see a distinction between especially the gold. Or sometimes you need, a large piece of stone is better than a pebble. So you'd see, these things are, one thing is much more useful. The gold can buy anything you want. And so generally people would, oh, that's gold. You walk by many pebbles, maybe walk past many rocks, and there's gold on the ground. You'll be attracted to it. But so that in this case, because there's a deep understanding of one's real self as a soul, it's not relevant. You don't care if you can buy everything. You're already happy, fully satisfied, tripta. So Prabhupada mentions in his purport, he's speaking about the jnana and vijnana, because jnana is more like theoretical knowledge, and the vijnana is realized or applied knowledge. He says, book knowledge without realization of the supreme truth is useless. By realized knowledge, one becomes perfect. By transcendental knowledge, one can remain steady in his convictions, but by mere academic knowledge, one can be easily deluded and confused by apparent contradictions. So we have been mentioning how when karma yoga moves into jnana, and this also means, vijnana, into realization, one begins to experience oneself as a soul. That allows for all these amazing transformations to take place. We can't imagine how we can be without any desires. We can't imagine how heat and cold and all these things can be the same. We can think about tolerating them, as Arjuna was instructed, but we can't imagine experience them as being the same. That's because we're so focused on them. Our attention is focused there. If we realize ourselves as a soul, we'll realize they're extraneous. They only seem important because we're focusing so much attention on them. So in order for this meditation to take place, and also in order for our deep progress in devotional service and bhakti, There has to be this level of realization. We have to experience what we're learning. So at first Arjuna was told about the soul, but he couldn't, he could understand it theoretically, but he couldn't experience it. And so then Krishna gave him the means to begin to do that, to set the groundwork, which was the karma yoga, which begins to bear fruit as the karma yoga turns into jnana. And now, when that jnana yoga becomes mature, they can actually withdraw their attention from everything else and experience oneself as a soul, and then see the super soul. But without the realization, you can understand it conceptually, but you can't really. It's hard to understand. You can't say, how can that really be? How can someone really experience it that way? Then in 6.9, a person is considered still further advanced when he regards honest well-wishers, affectionate benefactors, the neutral, mediators, the envious, friends and enemies, the pious and the sinners, all with an equal mind. So in one sense, this reminds us of the verse we saw previously, where we saw all different kinds of creatures the same, the elephants and the different kinds of humans, the brahmanas and the dog eaters and all the dogs and so many things. How we saw everyone as a spirit soul. But it's interesting here, it's also most of the entities and people here are in relation to the person who's perceiving them, which makes it even tougher. It says, honest well-wishers, affectionate benefactors, neutral, mediators, envious, friends and enemies. The pious and sinners, well, okay, those are more like we saw previously, the dog eaters and the saintly brahmanas. But what about the other ones? People who are dealing with you, who are your well-wishers, people who are your affectionate benefactors, people who are just neutral to you, mediators, envious, friends and enemies. It's hard to. So that's why I said this is more advanced than just seeing pebble stones and gold as that. It's easier with objects, and it's much more difficult with human beings, and especially those with whom you have a relationship. Your enemies can make life miserable for you, and your friends hopefully make it better. So it takes a higher level of realization to remember to see them as souls, and to not take them as differently from one another. Again, when a person is that much advanced in jnana, whether somebody's doing something good to you or bad to you, isn't so important, because the soul, we heard right from the beginning, is unchangeable. It's changeless. So it doesn't make any difference to you if you realize you're a soul. All this stuff is superficial. And of course we can tell that we don't realize ourselves as souls when we have our interactions with different sorts of people. So now we'll move into a next section, text 10 through 17, and it's going to talk about the practice in a little bit more detail, how it's done, how the yogis go about this meditational process. And in 10 it says, a transcendentalist, a yogi, should always engage his body, mind, and self in relationship with the Supreme, and concentrate in Krishna consciousness, Prabhupada says in the word-for-word translation. He should live alone in a secluded place and should always carefully control his mind. He should be free from desires and feelings of possessiveness. So here he got the body, by body, mind, and self, because he translated Atmanam. It means just self, and so Prabhupada says he's, like we said, Atma means so many different things. He's saying, in parentheses, his body, mind, and self. And so that it should be live alone in a secluded place and carefully control the mind and be free from any desires and feelings of possessiveness. So that's what you should do. The beginning. And Prabhupada says in his commentary, the first business of a transcendentalist is to keep the mind always on Krishna. One should always think of Krishna and not forget him even for a moment. Concentration of the mind on the Supreme is called samadhi, or trance. We ran across that in the last verses ago. In order to concentrate the mind, one should always remain in seclusion and avoid disturbance by external objects. He should be very careful to accept favorable and reject unfavorable conditions that affect his realization, and in perfect determination, he should not hanker after unnecessary material things that entangle him by feelings of possessiveness. So this is, this idea of withdrawing one's attention first from everything external, and then focusing it on the supersoul, on the Krishna, is clearly a difficult task. So you have to give yourself an environment, that's not too challenging. It's conducive to that sort of thing. And so that's why he's saying that you should remain in seclusion, avoid disturbance by external objects, and the like. So it's given a certain way that you give yourself a favorable environment for trying to accomplish that very difficult thing. And then the 6, 11, and 12 are together. To practice yoga, one should go to a secluded place and should lay kusha grass on the ground and then cover it with a deer skin and a soft cloth. The seat should be neither too high nor too low and should be situated in a sacred place. The yogi should then sit on it very firmly and practice yoga to purify the heart by controlling his mind, senses, and activities and fixing the mind on one point, eka agram. This is important. There's Prabhupada will mention this later actually, but there's two kinds of samadhi. It's kind of a preliminary one and then a mature, full-scale one. And the first one involves this eka agram, focusing the attention on one thing. Some of the Srila Baladev Vidyabhushan mentions that by, and I think this is given in the Bhagavad Purana in the 11th canto, by focusing the mind on certain material things, a yogi can gain mystical powers, siddhis. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur mentions a similar thing. He said that there's this kind of samadhi you can focus on external things or subtle things. Here, Krishna is going to recommend that we focus on him, focus on the Paramatma. But what happens is you try to collect your attention. This is called, fixing the mind on one thing is a preliminary type of samadhi called sampragyata samadhi. So you're trying to collect your attention from all the different places it is and focus it on one point. Actually, right now we're doing many things. We're always multitasking to some degree. Thinking and hearing and smelling and tasting and feeling. So many different things are happening at once. But the yogi wants to remove attention from everything else and begin to focus it on one point. That's this eka agram. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has kind of an interesting commentary on this verse, so I thought I would include it here. He says, he establishes his own asana, which has kusha on the bottom, then deer skin, and finally cloth on top. The yogi engages in meditation for purification of the inner organ or consciousness, atma vashuddhaye. By freedom from disturbance, the internal organ, he calls it the antakarana, this is like we call the subtle body, becomes very, very subtle. This makes it suitable for the direct realization of Brahman. The Shruti says, this is from the Katha Upanishad, Drishyate tvagraya buddhaya sukshmaya sukshma darshabi. Paramatma is seen by fine, concentrated intelligence, by the seers of the subtle. So this is in his word for word translation. Let me go back a little bit here. Prabhupada said that we're purifying the heart. This is what he said. Vishuddha. Where is it? Atma Vishuddhaye. Again, purifying the self. Okay. So Prabhupada translates it here as the heart, and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is saying that it's the whole subtle body. He calls it the antakarna. Prabhupada always calls it the subtle body. And the idea, so by focusing the mind on one point and on Paramatma, then we're refining the ability of our consciousness, because actually it says right now our consciousness is called contaminated consciousness. Chitta is an ingredient sometimes, and they analyze the ingredients of the world, and that's sometimes considered to be an ingredient. Chitta, contaminated consciousness. So when we withdraw it from all the external things and focus it on the Paramatma, it becomes purified, and it can begin to see the Paramatma and oneself. Take it away. It says by being focused on external material things, it loses some of its power. So that's what's happening. So by trying to fix all the attention in one spot, one trying to purify one's ability to experience spiritual things. And then Prabhupada mentions here, he says, and remember this Prabhupada was writing this many years ago, he says, this is before yoga was quite so popular as it is now, he says, the so-called yoga societies in big cities may be successful in earning material benefit, but they are not at all suitable for the actual practice of yoga. One who is not self-controlled and whose mind is not undisturbed cannot practice meditation. And so, I think we can clearly understand that generally yoga today we talk about, what people are maybe getting some peace of mind from it, but mostly it's better health, and nothing wrong with those things. But the yoga that's being talked about here in Bhagavad Gita is something much more profound, and Prabhupada's going to say very, very difficult. So let's see. And so the next two verses, 13 and 14, are also come together. One should hold one's body, neck and head erect in a straight line, and stare steadily at the tip of the nose. Thus, with an unagitated, subdued mind, devoid of fear, completely free from sex life, says Brahmacharya Vrata, one should meditate upon me within the heart and make me the ultimate goal of life. Important terms there. Krishna says, much chitta. Mat meaning upon me, and chitta concentrating the mind or the attention. And then he says, mat is me, and para, the ultimate goal. So that ekagra, the one place you're focusing the mind, is on Krishna as the Paramatma, Prabhupada says, and then that's the ultimate goal. You're not doing it for any other reason, that you are the purpose. That discovering the Lord is the purpose of your activity. And it says, mana samya, completely subduing the mind. When this preliminary type of samadhi increases and deepens, it will mean that the mind that we experience, the material mind, ceases to function. We'll hear about that. That's called asam pragyata samadhi. Okay, now Prabhupada has some comments here in his purport. He says, the goal of life is to know Krishna, who is situated within the heart of every living being as Paramatma, the four-handed Vishnu form. The yoga process is practiced in order to discover and see this localized form of Vishnu, and not for any other purpose. Okay? That was pretty clear from the verse. In the Bhakti school, A householder brahmachari is allowed controlled sex life because the cult of bhakti yoga is so powerful that one automatically loses sexual attraction being engaged in the superior service of the Lord. It's mentioned in the brahmachari vrata, means chastity. That should be clear too. If we're trying to withdraw our attention from everything, first of all physical, and then, sensual, and then, even mental and subtle, well, we have to remove all types of disturbances. That's why I said go in a solitary place in these things. So it becomes very difficult if there's any kind of sexual indulgence, even of the the most permissible sort, because the pleasure of it is very attractive. Takes the mind that way. So for someone trying to do it like that, trying to take the meditational process, chastity is completely essential. But here Prabhupada says the bhakti yoga is so powerful that one automatically loses sexual attraction being engaged in the superior service of the Lord. This is, again, we're talking about the higher taste of the wonderful the transformation that takes place. We talked in chapter 4. We talked about that transformation, how matter is transformed into spirit through service, and so through. By serving the Lord, one begins to experience this something more wonderful than we've ever experienced before, and then automatically that gradually that increases if we cultivate our bhakti properly, and the desire for things material will go down because of that. It's a kind of vijnana, realization that begins to happen. And it begins to happen in a very early stage. I've had people tell me that I just recently had two disciples of Srila Prabhupada tell me that one of them was speaking for themselves and the other one was speaking of his wife, that basically became devotees of Krishna because they tasted halava that was offered to Krishna. And that did it for them. Because they tasted something that was amazing. They tasted prasadam, offered food. Then Prabhupada says, the principles of the yoga system mentioned herein are different from those of the popular so-called yoga societies. So it's quite a different sort of yoga than we're used to, both in Prabhupada's day and also in these days. And then 15, thus practicing constant control of the body, mind, and activities, the mystic transcendentalist, his mind regulated, attains to the kingdom of God or the abode of Krishna by cessation of material existence. So this is also a powerful verse here. This is peace, shantim, and then nirvanam paramam, the cessation of material existence. Prabhupada says in mat stam, attaining Krishna, the spiritual sky, Prabhupada says here. Different commentators have looked at this slightly differently, but in any case, it's one experiences transcendence, and Prabhupada gives it's a pretty actually a fairly literal translation there. Prabhupada says, the ultimate goal in practicing yoga is now clearly explained. Yoga practice is not meant for attaining any kind of material facility. It is to enable the cessation of all material existence. See, it's interesting he mentions that because Srila Baladev Vidyabhushan, he looks at it and he says that somebody who he must be thinking of somebody who's fixing their mind on something other than Krishna. He says that they can attain siddhis or mystical powers which are less than cessation of material existence, and which is less than liberation, which is connected with Krishna. So he mentions that he mentions it that way. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur talks about, he says that they attain the impersonal Brahman effulgence, which is situated in the Lord. So the different commentators take different approaches. Usually what you do when there's contradictions, you see how they all can be. We know that different sorts of people, Prabhupada mentioned actually earlier in one of the purports, we didn't quote that part, but he said that there are those who seek out Brahman, there's those who seek out Paramatma, and there's those who seek out Bhagavan. And so those who seek out Bhagavan are completely successful, the Lord Himself. Those who seek out Paramatma and Brahman are partially successful, but have a chance to move on to complete success. So, we could see Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur being correct in saying there may be people who are really desiring Brahman. That's what they get. Those who desire the Paramatma get the Paramatma more. And here Prabhupada says that the yoga is not meant for any kind of mystic power. So that here it seemed pretty clearly, though, that they were saying to meditate on Krishna. He was saying to meditate on me. One who seeks an improvement in health or aspires after material perfection is no yogi, according to Bhagavad Gita. At least not the yoga that's being described here, isn't it? Nor does cessation of material existence entail one's entering into the void, which is only a myth. There is no void anywhere within the creation of the Lord. Rather, the cessation of material existence enables one to enter into the spiritual sky, the abode of the Lord. So when material existence ceases, there's spiritual existence there. And so, some people, as Prabhupada says, some people may attain Brahman, some people may see the super soul, other people may go directly to Krishna, depending upon their orientation. But there's something there. There's no void. And there's Nirvana Paramam, the cessation of material existence, and Matsamstam, the spiritual sky. Prabhupada translates it. It's kind of like where I'm situated. Where I'm situated there. Mat is me. Krishna is talking about him, and kind of Samsam is standing or situated there. So it's where he is. So I already mentioned in the 4th chapter that somebody who understands his transcendental nature, his appearance and activities, comes to him. So Prabhupada says if somebody is able to achieve a deep enough meditation, they have that possibility to experience transcendence. We say we reverse the absorption in material things, external material things, and attain to our original spiritual nature. And then 16 and 17, we're going to take those together. Part of the practice here is there is no possibility of one's becoming a yogi, O Arjuna, if one eats too much or eats too little, sleeps too much or does not sleep enough. He who is regulated in his habits of eating, sleeping, recreation, and work can mitigate all material pains by practicing the yoga system. So Prabhupada has a couple of things he says. He says, regulation of diet and sleep is recommended herein for the yogis. Too much eating means eating more than is required to keep the body and soul together. One who eats more than required will dream very much while sleeping, and he must consequently sleep more than is required. One should not sleep more than 6 hours daily. That's what he says. And then and he says, avyartha kalatvam. Here's another explanation and plug for bhakti. This is something that's not wasting any time. This is actually a quality we'll discover in the Nectar of Devotion about a very advanced devotee, somebody at the level of bhava, I believe. And Krishna says, Prabhupada says, a Krishna-conscious person cannot bear to pass a minute of his life without being engaged in the service of the Lord. Therefore, his sleeping is kept to a minimum. His ideal in this respect is Srila Rupa Goswami, who was always engaged in the service of Krishna and who could not sleep more than 2 hours a day, and sometimes not even that. Prabhupada was an example of one of these personalities, who was he slept very, very little. He was up much of the night translating and doing other work, mostly translating his Srimad Bhagavatam and other the books he was writing, constantly traveling. Can't be the happiness in serving Krishna becomes so powerful and intense that it says that they forget to sleep almost, forget to eat. This is a high level of Krishna consciousness. For us, we have to work our way up a little bit. It's a step-by-step process. Baladev Vidyabhushan, he gives a little formula for the eating. Prabhupada gives this in other places. I've read it in his books, different places. He said that you fill the stomach 1/4 with water, 1/2 with food, and 1/4 remains empty with air, and that makes the digestion very nice. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says the recreation for a yogi is walking. And Prabhupada that was his exercise as well. He used to have his morning walk. And also Baladev Vidyabhushan says that for the sleeping, one doesn't sleep in the beginning of the night or at the end of the night. So I guess one doesn't go to bed before it's night, and then gets up before it's morning, before night's over. That's the recommended thing for the yogis. It's clear, I think, from what they're trying to accomplish, these meditational type of yogis, the dhyana yogis, that they have to have things be very peaceful, very organized, very regulated in order for them to control their minds and the senses. So that, it's very important for them to do things in a very moderate way. If they're not sleeping enough, they're going to be sleepy. How are they going to focus their mind? If they're sleeping too much, then you get lazy. The mind isn't very sharp that way either. So just enough. They need to have a little exercise to keep their body healthy. Not too much to get exhausted. You want to try to build up lots of muscles, right? If you try to build up lots of muscles, takes more rest, more eating, this kind of stuff. So enough to stay healthy. All these different things. And that helps them to be able to have all of their faculties for this difficult meditation process. So then the last section of the verse of the chapter we're going to cover today, we're about halfway through after this, will be 18 through 23. And we're going to talk about that deeper level of samadhi. The one that happens when the concentrating the mind on one point, ekagra, becomes mature. So starting out with 18, when the yogi, by practice of yoga, disciplines his mental activities and becomes situated in transcendence, devoid of all material desires, he is said to be well established in yoga. It's a nispriha, devoid of desire, sarva kamebhya, all kinds of sense gratification, all kinds of desires. Kamebhya. And so Prabhupada says in his purport to this verse, he says, a perfect yogi is so well disciplined in the activities of the mind that he can no longer be disturbed by any kind of material desire. And I have a little commentary here on this verse from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, who says, when does the yogi perfect that yoga? This verse describes that situation, when the consciousness stops all movement, viniyatam chittam, and is firmly fixed without distraction in the self alone, atmani avatishtate, it is said to be perfect yoga. So let's see, Prabhupada had viniyatam, particularly disciplined in the mind. And what was the other? Boy, the memory's not so great here. And atmani avatishtate. And what does Prabhupada say about that? Atmani, in the transcendence, situated in transcendence. Prabhupada says the same thing, situated in transcendence. the interesting here is that the Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur, he says, the consciousness stops all movement, and we're going to discover that this other samadhi means that we attain spiritual consciousness, that we begin to deal with ourselves as a soul. It's not only the external body, but the internal body. They call it Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur and Baladev Vidyabhushan call it the antakarana. We usually call it the subtle body. No longer functions in that deep samadhi. It's only the soul is only aware of itself and of Paramatma. So here in 19, and it describes that state with a nice little poetic image. As a lamp in a windless place does not waver, so the transcendentalist whose mind is controlled remains always steady in his meditation on the transcendent self. And Prabhupada says, a truly Krishna-conscious person, always absorbed in transcendence and constant undisturbed meditation on his worshipable Lord, is as steady as a lamp in a windless place. So it's also true of devotees. But for these particular type of yogis, it's just, that's it. There's no movement of the external or the subtle bodies. And then Prabhupada says, he says, unless the mind is fixed on the lotus feet of the Lord, by constant remembrance, such transcendental engagements are not practical. In the devotional service of the Lord, therefore, these prescribed activities are called archana, or engaging all the senses in the service of the Lord. The senses and the mind require engagements. Simple abnegation is not practical. Therefore, for people in general, especially those who are not in the renounced order of life, transcendental engagement of the senses and the mind, as described above, is the perfect process for transcendental achievement, which is called yukta in the Bhagavad Gita. So another plug for bhakti, because his point is that he says that that the senses and the mind require engagements. Simple abnegation is not practical. So he's really saying that that we can't do what these yogis are doing, and so how to approach it in a practical way. And so above in the purport there was mention of Maharaj Ambarish, who was engaged in so many different ways in service, engaging all of his different senses. He's kind of the perfect example of engaging all the senses in the Lord's service. And that's why he says mentions above, as described above. He says. He says he's going to, and it's true. I mean, there's no way. I think we should be able to understand even by now that how can we completely stop the mind and the senses? So he says bhakti allows us to do it by spiritualizing them. Now the last three verses, 20 to 23, are together, and they were too big for me to take a screenshot of, so I just had to put the translation here in the PowerPoint. In the stage of perfection, called trance or samadhi, one's mind is completely restrained from material mental activities by practice of yoga. This perfection is characterized by one's ability to see the self by the pure mind and to relish and rejoice in the self. In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness, realized through transcendental senses. Established thus, one never departs from the truth, and upon gaining this, he thinks there is no greater gain. Being situated in such a position, one is never shaken, even in the midst of greatest difficulty. This, indeed, is actual freedom from all miseries arising from material contact. So by the pure mind, this means, Prabhupada will explain also in the purport, and the bliss is what it says, that ability to see the self, is capital S, means Paramatma, by the pure mind, and relish and rejoice in the self In that joyous state, one is situated in boundless transcendental happiness realized through transcendental senses. So this pure mind or pure consciousness, because again it's Atma, is a feature of the soul. Prabhupada mentions this in his purport. And he says, by practice of yoga, one becomes gradually detached from material concepts. This is the primary characteristic of the yoga principle. And after this, one becomes situated in trance or samadhi, which means that the yogi realizes the supersoul through transcendental mind and intelligence, without any misgivings of identifying the self with the super self. So transcendental mind and intelligence. So it doesn't mean the mind that we have now or the intelligence we have now, that subtle body no longer functioning. As souls, we have a transcendental mind, a transcendental intelligence. Prabhupada called it the pure mind in the translation. So we see the super soul through the eyes of the soul, and see the soul through the eyes of the soul. If they're able to fully absorb themselves. So first by concentration, it says that purifies that they then begin to perceive the super soul, and then that purification goes to a complete, where the attention is taken away from. It's not that the material mind and the subtle body disappear, but the attention is withdrawn from them completely. So first, from the external things, then from the senses, then from the mind, intelligence and ego. Attention is withdrawn from all the things. They call it the internal organ, the antakarana, or the subtle body. So from everything physical, sensual, and subtle, the attention is withdrawn, and then there's you and the super soul and a whole lot of happiness, it says. And Prabhupada says, and here he describes those two types of samadhi. He says, in the yoga system, as described in this chapter, there are two kinds of samadhi, called sampragyata samadhi and asampragyata samadhi. There is no longer, it says, when one becomes situated in a transcendental position by various philosophical researches, he is said to have achieved sampragyata samadhi. In the asampragyata samadhi, there is no longer any connection with mundane pleasure, for one is then transcendental to all sorts of happiness derived from the senses. When the yogi is once situated in that transcendental position, he is never shaken from it. So the first, there's this kind of a concentration, attempt to concentrate everything, and that begins to purify the subtle body. It becomes more purified, more refined, and then ultimately all attention is taken away from it, and one begins to experience things with the senses and the mind of the soul. Then Prabhupada gives a couple of explanations here about impersonalism. He mentioned previously that you see the super soul without any misconception about merging with it. So he says Purushartha. He's dealing here with Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras. It talks about Ashtanga Yoga. Purushartha means material religiosity, economic development, sense gratification, and at the end, the attempt to become one with the Supreme. We say moksha. This oneness with the Supreme, he has this in quotation marks, is called kaivalyam by the monist. But according to Patanjali, this kaivalyam is an internal or transcendental potency by which the living entity becomes aware of its constitutional position. He quotes that there's a little bit of Sanskrit that says that later on in the purport from Patanjali, that it's a transcendental potency by where you come to your svarup. That's kaivalyam, when all of your attention goes in one place. That's oneness. That's the oneness he's talking about. And then one awakens to one's spiritual nature. Like I said, right now, we're just so distracted. We're like a kid playing a video game and we forget ourselves. We have that terminology. If we're really absorbed in some activity, we say we forget ourselves. We've done that. We have forgotten ourselves. So we remember ourselves when finally we pull our attention away from all the various distractions. And then Prabhupada says there is an acceptance of transcendental pleasure in the Patanjali system, but the monists do not accept this transcendental pleasure out of fear of jeopardizing the theory of oneness. This may be a little surprising to you because I think most monists or impersonalists these days think that you will merge with the divine and experience happiness, which means that they still have an individual experience. That somehow you merge into the light, but you feel happiness from that. And that actually, of course, if the Gyanis who do that merge into Brahman, that's what happens. It's called Brahmananda. But real, rigorous impersonalists from the Shankaracharya school, he's the one who invented it, the notion of that there's only oneness, there is only one thing. He says that this world, and also us as individuals, is simply illusion, and there only exists Brahman, the one thing, one without a second. And so that when we become enlightened, the illusion is over. And well, if we were there to realize it, we would realize that we no longer exist. It was just an illusion. So there is no individual experience. Our individual experience was an illusion. Now it's gone. We never separated from it, and we never merged with it, really. That's the real oneness. Means that there can't be two things. So technically, they wouldn't have no pleasure. Just cease to exist. The illusion stops, and your illusory existence with it. Okay. And then Prabhupada gives another plug for bhakti. And I think by hearing how the yogis handle this process of meditation, I think we can heartily agree with him. The best practice of yoga in this age is Krishna consciousness, which is not baffling, he says. A Krishna-conscious person is so happy in his occupation that he does not aspire after any other happiness. There are many impediments, especially in this age of hypocrisy, to practicing Hatha Yoga, Dhyana Yoga, and Jnana Yoga. But there is no such problem in executing Karma Yoga or Bhakti Yoga. So he's pointing out that in Krishna consciousness and in Bhakti, that same happiness that comes while other samadhi is available to us. And we begin to experience it, of course, not full-fledged from the beginning, but we begin to experience something of it very, very quickly. And if we're dedicated to the practice, it begins to become, two things happen. It becomes more constant and then more intense. So the same opportunity is there without having to stop the senses from acting, without having to ultimately stop the mind from acting. How can we do that? And instead of dealing with the Paramatma, we're dealing with the source of the Paramatma. So Prabhupada gives us a plug for bhakti. So next time we'll finish chapter 6. And then after that, we're into the main. Prabhupada even mentioned in one of the purports here that the next chapter we're going to deal intensely with bhakti. He mentioned in one of the purports here that I didn't quote it here, but he mentioned that. Chapter 7, we're going to start talking exclusively about bhakti. So it'll become very interesting for us. This is all fascinating stuff. The whole Bhagavad Gita is wonderful, but we're going to get into the things that are really, really the most dear to our hearts.